Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. So nice to welcome everyone here today. My name is Lina Al-Qadoumi, and I am the Gender Equality Manager at UN Global Compact. We're here today to discuss understanding the business of gender responsive procurement, and I'm joined by my colleagues at UN Women as well, who you'll be meeting shortly. We are dialing in from New York and from Pretoria and would love to hear where everyone is dialing in from. So please feel free to use the chat function on the Zoom webinar. Would love to hear where you're dialing in from, what your name is, and what company you represent. Wow. Very international audience. UNIC, UAE, Ireland, Brazil, London, Sri Lanka, India, Bolivia, Spain, Albania, Denmark. I'm not going to be able to list all these countries, but great representation from around the world. Wonderful. So today's session is going to be highly interactive. And also, if you feel more comfortable listening in on other languages, we have live translation available in English, French, Spanish, and Portuguese. In your webinar controls, you can click on the button that says interpretation, and then click the language that you would like to hear this session in. And as a second option, you can hear the interpreted language only by clicking mute original audio. And alternatively, there are closed captions available in English. So whatever you're comfortable with today. So as you have already located the chat function, we welcome high interactivity throughout the session. There's also a Q&A function where we ask you to input any of the questions that you would like to ask any of the speakers that will be presenting today, and we will get to them at the end of the session. We also have some Mentimeter polls that will be taking place throughout the session. So please have your phone handy because we're going to ask you to scan a QR code shortly. So this is how the day will be set up. We will have some introductory remarks from UN Global Compact and from UN Women. And then we will go through a little bit of an introduction and framing of the discussion of gender responsive procurement. We will then later be joined by our colleague from Unilever to hear about the business case for gender responsive procurement and how they've been able to implement it and grow it within the institution. And then we'll culminate with a Q&A. So to kick off the session, we would love to hear from you. So now is the time to take your phones out and scan the following QR code that you will see on the screen shortly. If the QR code doesn't work for you for any reason, then please open the Safari or whatever application on your phone and input the following code 49307703. And you should be able to then access the first question on the Mentimeter poll. So we'll give everybody a few seconds. Okay, so the first question is, does your company keep track of their suppliers by disaggregating the sex of the owner of the company? Yes, no, I'm not quite sure. Okay, so it looks like the majority is no, and I'm not sure, so wonderful. Great context for the discussion today. Second question, does your company actively engage with their suppliers on issues like decent work, labor, and/or gender? Yes, wonderful. So nice to see. Okay. All right. Seems like the majority is yes. Thank you so much for your inputs. Okay, so now I have the privilege of introducing my colleague Cynthia Mufu, who is the head of Human Rights and Gender here at UN Global Compact, to say a few words.
Thank you so much, Lena. And yes, welcome everybody. I'm Cynthia Mufu, and I'm the head of Human Rights and Gender, as Lena has said. And it is so incredibly lovely to see so many of you joining us today. I think at the last check, we were over 800 attendees, which just speaks volumes to clearly the need for this webinar in terms of understanding the business of GRP, of gender responsive procurement. And we will certainly go into that in more detail. So I'm really, really thrilled to have you all here. But I wanted to start by just setting the scene as to why really that, we are doing this webinar. Here at the Global Compact, our objective as it relates to our gender equality work is really very simple. It's all about mobilizing our companies to take concrete action and to demonstrate measurable impact to advance gender equality across the workplace, the marketplace, and the community. Our work is firmly grounded in the Women's Empowerment Principles, the WEPs, as we call it, which was developed in partnership with UN Women in 2010. Now, the WEPs calls for business to adopt a holistic approach to gender equality, but it really is about taking action to empower women, as I said, across the workplace, the marketplace, and the community. Women's Empowerment Principle 5 on implementing supply chain and marketing practices that empower women really talks about enabling companies to influence business partners through inclusive supply chain policies and standards of engagement, and to use advertising as a powerful driver to change perceptions and to impact social norms, portraying men and women in modern, authentic, multi-dimensional roles. This is not an easy thing to do. And as we can see from the number of attendees today, and we also did a session last night for our friends and our colleagues in Asia, it is something that is needed. It is something that we need to understand how we can contribute. Now, corporate commitment to gender equality has increased significantly since the launch of the WEPs in 2010, which is very, very encouraging. We have currently over 8,000 global business leaders who are signed the CEO statement to support the WEPs. Yet, there are significant gaps in terms of implementation of these commitments to gender equality. And so really, how do we go about accelerating progress? And how do we go about making impact? It all lies in the data. Now, our WEP's gender gap analysis tool indicates that most companies have yet to actually adopt policies and practices to ensure that their commitment to gender equality is implemented across their supply chain. That is why we're here today. And to achieve gender equality and economic empowerment, as set out in the SDG 5 by 2030, the Global Compact knows that we have to act. We have to mobilize our companies to heighten their commitment to meeting the target through our gender strategy, our work with the private sector and our stakeholders. Because perhaps empowering female entrepreneurs might just be that uncharted silver bullet to accelerating the pace of change. And frankly, we need to accelerate that pace of change. We cannot continue as business as usual. So what is gender responsive procurement? Now, absolutely, the colleagues we have here will go into that in more depth. But really, at a very sort of simple level, it's about companies leveraging their purchasing policies and practices to promote gender equality and to support social and economic progress through gender responsive measures at all stages and tiers of their procurement and supply chain. Women-owned businesses still face a number of barriers as women struggle to access and participate in both local and global supply chains. Yet, as our colleague from Unilever will discuss, the business case for gender responsive procurement is strong. The business case for gender equality is strong, but the business case for gender responsive procurement is also very strong. By extending gender equality commitments and actions across the value chain, and ensuring that gender considerations are included into procurement decision making and practices, businesses can manage human rights risks, they can build brand loyalty, they can expand supply availability, and boost innovation and profitability. So, no matter how large or small, every business has a role to play in moving the needle to achieve gender equality and the Sustainable Development Goals. So once again, I am really thrilled that you have joined us in your numbers, and I hope, and I'm absolutely sure, that you will find this session really informative, practical, and be a guide to that moving from commitment to action where gender responsive procurement is concerned. So now I have the distinct pleasure to hand you over to my colleague from UN Women, Seaman Gayum, who is actually the policy advisor on sustainable development. Seam, over to you.
Thanks so much, Cynthia and Lena, and good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to colleagues and participants. On behalf of UN Women, we are delighted to be here with the UN Global Compact. I'd like to add my welcome to the huge number of participants we have today. It's simply amazing to see such interest in gender responsive procurement. UN Women has been working on gender responsive procurement since its establishment in 2010. We support both the public and private sectors, including governments, civil society, and companies in this work. As Cynthia has mentioned, the Women's Empowerment Principles, or WEPs, were also co-created with the UN Global Compact in 2010. And the WEPs laid the foundation for UN Women's engagement with the private sector by providing a framework for gender-responsive supply chain management. So between 2018 and 2021, UN Women supported over 1,000 governments, companies, and international organizations to develop and or implement policies and practices related to gender-responsive procurement. My UN Women colleague will explain what we mean by gender-responsive procurement, but in short, gender-responsive procurement refers to procurement to improve social and economic outcomes for women. And this is done by creating more opportunities for women's businesses and encouraging business practices that contribute to gender equality. Virtually all businesses like yours must undertake procurement, but we know that procurement is not gender neutral. We know that globally, 1 in 3 businesses are owned by women, but women only win an estimated 1% of the procurement spend of large corporations. Our work in gender-responsive procurement has found that this occurs because of many reasons. First, procurement remains a boys' club, where contracts are often based on connections. In that same vein, women entrepreneurs often lack networks, which not only excludes them from calls for procurement, but also undermines their access to mentorship, coaching, and partnership. Because of this, women may lack information and the skills that are in demand. Another significant facet of procurement is, unfortunately, discrimination. Discriminatory social norms and occupational and market gender segregation mean women are not on a level playing field. Furthermore, procurement is often characterized by long processes and payment cycles and multiple checkboxes, something that smaller companies, including women's micro and small enterprises, simply cannot meet. It is thus so encouraging to see all of you here today. We can only achieve gender equality and women's empowerment through our collective and strategic action. With that, I'll end by saying that achieving gender equality and the empowerment of women is the responsibility of everyone. UN Women is the global champion for these goals, but relies on a worldwide network of partners and allies to carry this urgent work forward. So we call upon all of you here today to make a greater commitment to these goals, and we stand ready to support as partners all who wish to begin or continue their engagement with gender-responsive procurement. Thank you. And with that, I'd like to turn over to my colleague from UN Women, Anna Golub.
Thank you so much. I'm going to share my screen. Great. Greetings. Thank you. And thanks, Simi, and to the Global Compact and to the Academy. And thank you to all these many participants who've joined today to learn about these topics, and also my fellow panelists. My name is Anna Golub, and I work on economic empowerment and policy at UN Women. In my role, I help guide knowledge generation, policy development and implementation, and advocacy to support women's entrepreneurship and decent work around the world. My particular area of expertise is in gender-responsive procurement, which is our focus today. Today, I will talk about what we mean by gender-responsive procurement, the strategic value of businesses practicing gender-responsive procurement, and some thinking on best practices, including considerations on how to practice gender-responsive procurement. You will then hear later an interview that will help see these actions put into practice. So before we get started, I would like to take a step back. I would like to take a step back because I know we are here to learn about the business of gender-responsive procurement and how it relates to business and business priorities. You may be interested in this topic from the perspective of your business or organization, or you may be interested in this topic as an individual stakeholder committed to gender equality, even outside of your role in your company or organization. For that reason, there is no one business case for gender-responsive procurement because we are all persuaded by different factors. Therefore, I'd like you to wear two hats. One as a company or organization interested in innovation, productivity, and growth, and one as a person who believes that equality and dignity for all is a value in itself that goes hand in hand with the business need to generate returns and grow to support our daily lives now and in the future. So let's talk about practical ways you and your business can leverage processes and relationships to contribute to gender equality and how this can benefit us all. UN Women defines gender-responsive procurement as the selection of services, goods, and civil works that considers their impact on gender equality and women's empowerment. To unpack what that means, let's first discuss what we mean by procurement, then we can talk about how to make it gender-responsive. Procurement is a critical process for all organizations that require inputs that they do not produce themselves. Government alone procure 13 trillion a year globally, and the global value of business-to-business e-commerce is 21 trillion, suggesting that private sector procurement represents an even vaster market. It is estimated that the private sector contributes 72% of GDP in OECD countries. Procurement systems consist of a complex web of value chains, policies, relationships, and economic interests of diverse stakeholders that span the globe. Procurement, whether private or public, is a formidable wind in the sails of the global economy, connecting buyers, suppliers, and consumers around the world. Although some of the principal tenets of procurement center on fairness and integrity, procurement systems are not fair and equitable. They are riven with gender gaps in access to and benefit from procurement opportunities. The interests and needs of women as suppliers, workers, and consumers are rarely considered in procurement organizations. Women are particularly disadvantaged due to structural discrimination, adverse norms, and an unequal division of labor associated with care. This leads to gender gaps in labor force participation, pay, and business outcomes. A gender perspective is necessary to understand how inequality is entrenched in procurement processes, but also how these processes can be leveraged to contribute to economic rights and justice for women. So a gender perspective or gender lens involves considering how people who identify as different genders experience the world differently due to factors such as discrimination, structural inequality, and adverse social norms. There are many types of tools that use lenses to help you analyze what cannot be seen with the naked eye. A microscope helps you see details very closely and what is inside of what you were looking at. This is the type of analysis that might be useful for looking at the sex disaggregated data in your company and whether or not women are represented. Binoculars help you see things at a distance. For example, if you want to see how your practices influence society externally. And then a telescope helps you see things at an even greater distance, including outside of the galaxy. So, for example, looking at our long-term goals and achieving the Sustainable Development Goals, we can use a telescope to see how our private sector practices are influencing the global economy and development. And then, of course, a periscope uses prisms you cannot see that are out of direct sight. For example, you may want to look at the way that gender is intersected with other factors such as disability, and race. So companies can use all of these types of lenses to identify gender inequality internally and externally. Traditionally, gender responsive procurement has focused on supplier diversity, sourcing from women-owned businesses. 1/3, as we mentioned, of all businesses are women's enterprises, but they get only 1% of procurement opportunities in the private sector. More recently, UN Women and others, including the ILO and the UN Global Compact, have embraced the notion that GRP is also about sourcing from gender-responsive companies. Put simply, a gender-responsive enterprise is one that meets the criteria for integrating gender equality and women's empowerment principles into its policies and practices that are in alignment with international norms and standards. To be considered gender-responsive, comprehensive compliance with the women's empowerment principles and ILO labor standards would be required. The main idea behind including sourcing from gender-responsive enterprises as well as women's enterprises as part of gender-responsive procurement is that it can support women entrepreneurs, but also workers by incentivizing companies to have better practices all around the world so that women workers and women entrepreneurs can be economically empowered from procurement opportunities. So 2 questions that emerge. You might be wondering, how does gender-responsive procurement benefit companies? And second, how do you even define a gender-responsive enterprise? So first, I'd like to, on the first question, I'm pleased to share with you some highlights from UN's women's research on the business case for gender-responsive procurement, which was led by my colleague, Jocelyn Chu. Through engagement with over 250 stakeholders in the form of communities of practice, individual interviews, and a survey, as well as analysis with case studies, UN Women found, first, companies practicing GRP benefited from increased revenue and reduced procurement spend. This is due to a broader range of suppliers from GRP, many of which become customers of the business itself. Secondly, companies who practice GRP saw greater supplier availability and resilience. This is an important and key finding due to the global supply chain issues we are seeing. Third, GRP strengthened companies' brand satisfaction across a wide range of stakeholders, including customers, peers, investors, and employees. And all of this increases business and brand loyalty. We also found that GRP is associated with more innovation and adaptivity and can improve service delivery, such as increases in efficiency, customer service, and productivity, primarily due to the influx of new diverse talent from GRP. Lastly, by practicing GRP, companies contribute to strengthening markets through economic development and inclusive growth. And this leads to new and expanding opportunities for the business themselves. For the second question about defining a gender-responsive enterprise, let me share some of our thinking. There are a number of frameworks that articulate key principles behind business practices that promote gender equality and empower women. They can be used to build a common understanding of what a gender-responsive enterprise is. Of course, the first is the women's empowerment principles. We know that the WEPs include high-level corporate leadership, equality in the workplace, health and human safety, including protection from sexual harassment, education and advancement opportunities, inclusive supply chain and marketing, education and community activism, and transparency and reporting. The WEPs are meant to apply to all companies, regardless of size, industry, and age. There are also a few other frameworks that are really helpful to consider, including the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, which are endorsed by the Human Rights Council and acknowledge that while the state is obligated to respect, protect, and fulfill human rights with fundamental freedoms for all people, business enterprises are required to respect human rights and comply with applicable laws. The ILO Tripartite Declaration on Principles Concerning Multinational Enterprises and Social Policy, the M&E Declaration, is guidance for companies based on international labor standards and has been available for more than 40 years with consistent updates. It covers issues ranging from occupational health and safety to equal pay for work of equal value and collective bargaining. Finally, another example is the OECD guidelines for multinational enterprises. The OECD guidelines provide non-binding principles and standards based on international normative frameworks. The guidelines describe how multinational companies can have an impact on human rights and references the key frameworks and recommendations from which these are drawn. So how would a company in practice implement these ideas? For a comprehensive manual on the types of institutional actions your company can take to eliminate barriers facing women's enterprises and accessing procurement opportunities, please check out The Power of Procurement: How to Source from Women-Owned Businesses. This has a lot of important practical information about how to do strategic sourcing, such as nurturing open information in social networks, paying promptly, limiting contract sizes, providing feedback, and collecting data. It becomes a little trickier when it comes to sourcing from gender-responsive enterprises. Given the complexity and scope of procurement and gender equality norms and standards related to business, identifying a gender-responsive business for the purpose of procurement is not a straightforward task. There are many aspects of gender equality and women's empowerment about which an enterprise may have policies and practices, from pay equality, representation and management, to diversity in the workplace. A mapping of indicators from several leading organizations that monitor gender equality in companies revealed nearly 250 indicators. Common indicators cover everything from whether or not certain policies are in place, such as equal opportunity employment policy, quantitative key performance indicators, such as pay gaps and women in leadership, as well as participation, such as through partnerships and corporate social responsibility activities. Tracking all the possible indicators would be too costly and too difficult for most procurement departments. Yet tracking too few might make impact less meaningful. For example, companies consider women's representation on corporate boards to be a key indicator of gender equality in a company. Women are severely underrepresented among top leadership in companies, but their representation there does not say anything about the conditions of women workers at lower levels, or even with respect to smaller businesses and subcontractors in their supply chain. I'm going to skip this slide for time so we have more time for questions. A few considerations should be borne in mind. First, the gender responsiveness of a company is dynamic rather than static, meaning frequent and regular comprehensive monitoring is essential to track impact. And while there are many types of companies that monitor gender equality, coordination is a challenge, and the data used are not standardized, and firm-level data is protected or proprietary. For the purposes of procurement, companies consistently call for a user-friendly tool to monitor and assess gender responsiveness that does not require costly validation. If the requirements for verification are too cumbersome, women's enterprises might actually be negatively affected. Complex procedures and burdensome requirements hold many businesses back because they tend to be smaller with less capacity to respond to verification requests. Another practical consideration is that diversity of businesses, again, there's diversity of businesses like there's diversity of women, and there's not a one-size-fits-all approach. The standards for gender responsiveness of a multinational corporation with hundreds of thousands of employees might be different or from the micro or small and medium enterprise. So how do we overcome these challenges? Well, fortunately, we have people here today that have practical experience, and we will hear from them. But I just want to say and reiterate from my colleagues that procurement connects us all, and it's a multi-trillion-dollar business opportunity, and we have a lot to build on. Whether you are a worker, entrepreneur, activist, or policymaker, we could use your help. And because multi-stakeholder engagement is critical for a transformative and sustainable impact on women and the world of work. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Anna. That was super interesting and a great context for the discussion to come. So now it's my privilege to introduce Sandra Fontano. Sandra is the Senior Global Sustainability Manager of Social Equity and Inclusion at Unilever. Hi, Sandra. Nice to see you.
Hi, Lena. Lovely to see you again.
So, Sandra, I'd love to hear about Unilever's take on everything that was discussed today. I know Unilever is an industry leader in sustainable procurement practices and gender responsive procurement more specifically. So if you could just share with us a little bit about why gender inclusive sourcing is a key strategy for Unilever. How does the company view it from the business case?
Perfect. Yeah, thank you for that, and thank you for having me on. Such an engaging and I think that this is just really important for us to discuss, and happy to share any learnings that we can to be able to get more people on this journey. We know that corporations spend trillions of euros each year acquiring goods and services. But as Seaman said earlier on, that 1% of how much is being spent on women is still there. It's kind of a static number, and it's not shifting fast enough. Undeniable returns in terms of how empowering women helps them and their communities and the countries and their families. And there's statistics that show that investing in women, there's a huge percentage of that investment that then turns into an investment back into their families and into their communities in comparison to others. And so from our perspective, gender responsive procurement is important because we believe that women's equality is one of the single greatest unlocks around social and economic development globally. And we want to make sure that we're leveraging that, not just for us as a business from a profitability perspective and return on investment, but in terms of expanding the global markets, diversifying those supply chains, and growing the economy world. At the moment, around 70% diverse spend is with women-owned businesses. However, our journey is just beginning. The beginning of this stage, we are still learning. Yes, it may be a big corporation, but that relate to join this journey, and we would encourage everyone to jump on board. And we know that there's a gender gap in the level of entrepreneurship across our categories and our portfolios of purchase. So in 2013, that you were talking about earlier on, and we're implementing these principles across our business. And in 2021 was when we launched our Compass commitment. Our Compass commitment is a commitment to spend 2 billion per year with diverse suppliers. Yes, we have partnerships with a whole host of various different partners across the world, because we know that we can't do this by ourselves, and we need to work with others, both to learn and to share those best practices and to understand how to be able to further this agenda more effectively and efficiently across the different women organizations, diverse businesses, and to engage people authentically in this space.
Super interesting, Sandra, and I love that that Unilever's primary focus is that you're taking the rights-based approach, knowing that this is first of all good for for women, and what we do know, the evidence is clear that when you invest in a woman, you're investing in her family, in her community, in the local economy. So it ultimately, you know, benefits all and benefits business at the same time. So I know that Unilever has set a very aggressive goal of spending 2 billion euros with diverse suppliers by 2025. I'd love to hear more about how you came about with this target, and can you share an update on the progress now that we are less than 2 years to 2025?
Yeah, no, by all means. So Unilever, we've been driving women's economic empowerment, gender equality for quite a few years now. It was our previous sustainability plan was called the Unilever Sustainability Plan. And it had some specific targets on supporting women through safety, skills, finished in 2020, at which point we knew that we were able to look at what we were doing and see how and where we could start to advance things in new areas and how we could continue to build on some areas. And some of the kind of success stories from there was that we achieved, for example, gender balance across our management level 1 year ahead of target through the plans and the targets that we had for the Unilever Sustainable Living Plan. And so then once that came to the end and we launched our Compass, our business strategy, the new business strategy that was going to move us forward. From 2021, we took that ambitious step to launch the global and transparently reported target, which was around spending 2 billion euros with diverse suppliers by 2025. We knew that this was going to be a stretch target. We had various programs already in North America and in South Africa that had been running since 2017 and 2018, but this was the first time we were going to be looking at understanding how do we do this globally? There's already like programs, local programs in 2 or 3 key markets that we knew were doing great stuff, but we knew we needed that could have a bigger impact, a significantly bigger impact. And so through a market expansion program, we've designed and launched programs in various markets around the world, partnering with expert supply diversity NGOs, creating the enabling environment for diverse suppliers to gain access to Unilever supply chain. And currently, as of 2022, we reported a diverse spend of 818 million euros with diverse suppliers. So we're on that journey. There is a plan to get us to that 2 billion. And there are stages that you have to go through to be able to both get people on board, understand, educate. I think sometimes there's often an assumption that everyone automatically understands both the benefit, the reason why, but actually it takes time, and that education piece and engagement piece is a long-term part of the plan, as well as the work that we do with the partners.
Wow, Sandra, thank you so much. I mean, this is clearly a top priority for Unilever. If there's so much, effort and attention paid to building out a strategy to hitting the 2 billion euros, I'm sure it isn't easy if you have such a also multi-tiered supply chain worldwide. So kudos to you and to your team for continuing, and I'm sure you'll hit the 2 billion target by 2025. Of course, with all of these strategies comes challenges. So would love to hear you candidly share some of the challenges that you face in implementing your supplier diversity program. I'm sure many people participating on the call have encountered similar challenges, and it would be great to hear how you've been able to overcome them as well.
Yeah, by all means. I mean, it's yes, there are definitely challenges. we're not gonna pretend that there aren't. And data and information is probably one of the biggest challenges that that we have, and I think it's probably not just unique to us. I'm going to assume that actually it's a challenge across a number of different big organizations that are doing this. There's for example, there's no centralized technology or platform or database to be able to search for qualified corporate ready diverse suppliers. Different diverse providers have their own databases, etc. So sometimes that's quite tricky to be able to know that you're tapping into the right place to try and find the right people, and so then that's also a bit tricky. There's the certification infrastructure, which in some cases is also quite limited. So obviously countries like South Africa and North America are very well versed in certification, in the benefits of it, in it being very much almost a norm. But in other countries, there's a large percentage of those diverse suppliers, both the suppliers and the countries where the concept of certification is new. There's a lack of understanding in terms of the potential benefits that it brings, and so again it requires support, engagement to either try and get people certified, or otherwise we have to heavily rely on self-declaration supported by light touch verification. So there's various ways to support, but it just certification definitely makes it a lot easier from our perspective, because it means that the data is being certified by organizations that support the different groups, be it women or any of the other groups, diverse groups that we're procuring from. Data privacy risks. Obviously, that's a big concern for everyone, and in certain markets and geographies, that's more of an issue in some than others, especially in markets like Europe. In France, for example, it's prohibited to process personal information pertaining to an individual's race, health, sexual orientation. The EU GDPR law also provides the toughest privacy security laws around collection, storage, and security of personal data. So it's there to protect, and we all understand that. But there's when you're trying to do the procure from diverse suppliers, it's sometimes it's also quite tough. So there's hopefully it would be brilliant to find ways to make that work better, or kind of more optimal, as it were, whilst respecting all of the legal privacy and data concerns that people may have. And then also sometimes there's an assumption, and it's not always correct, but there is an assumption that lots of the diverse businesses also happen to sometimes be small or limited to maybe a few geographies, and sometimes working with international organizations, we often sometimes need to work across countries. Sometimes that's something that is it's not necessarily a barrier or a challenge. It's just it's sometimes there just at the back of the mind in terms of various the projects or the work, how quickly that scale can come, considering the size of the corporations.
Wonderful, very interesting. Clearly many challenges, but as Anna mentioned earlier in her presentation, it is an iterative process, and it's a journey. I don't think any company has it right yet, but you know, we're as long as we're growing and we're learning and committing to you know, the ecosystem of support. I think that's super important. Can you share any success stories, possibly if you've measured impact from your commitment to sustainable procurement and across the organization?
Yeah. It cut out just there at the end, Lena, but I think I caught the majority of that question. So in terms of success stories, I mean, we've got there's some brilliant partnerships that we have in place with the organizations like the WeConnects, MSD UK's, etc., where there's partnerships, accelerators, trainings that are taking place in certain countries that are there to really be able to build and build the skills, provide access to the mentorship, understand the networks and help build the networks, or sometimes in some cases provide access to finance, depending on the geographies and the program, etc. So we've got a variety of those different programs which are all working and developing and aiming to help lift everyone that, or as many people as we can, that can hopefully at some point one day lead into our supply chain or other supply chains. And so there's a variety of those that are taking place all around the world. But then also in terms of examples of how some women-owned businesses are supplying Unilever, we've got there's an Afro-Brazilian women-owned agency whose innovative collaboration with Unilever Brazil has seen the collaboration expand to Latin America, to El Salvador, and we've ended up spending double year on year since the mid 2020. There's a excellent story from Kenya, where there's a woman-owned plastics producer that's delivering recycled plastic products for us over there, with the goal of helping us to reduce our plastic footprint. So again, those organizations that support us in terms of reaching our other what we call our compass, our business strategy commitments around climate and the environment and other social ambitions. That's always kind of incredibly useful for us. And there's a woman-owned logistics company in Turkey as well that provides agile and integrated logistics solutions, and have been a global leader in supporting women's participation in education and CSR. So there's a host of different on the ground stories, but also some of those global partnerships are led in us also explore and understand how we help businesses where help is needed. And so, yeah.
Thank you so much, Sandra. I hope that you continue to grow the success of the program and continue to collect more wonderful stories of that demonstrate the impact of including women in global supply chains. So now I'd like to take a few questions from the audience. Thank you so much for providing the questions in the Q&A function. There are 33 questions, so I don't think we'll get to all of them in the next 9 minutes. However, I will maybe propose 2 questions at a time, and if anybody on the panel would like to share their remarks, then please feel free to step in. So the first question is from Gareth. Do we know why women struggle to access the supply chain procurement departments? Second question from Sanjay is, what is the most scientific and practical process to engage women in procurement in the manufacturing industrial sector, where there are male staff already engaged? Who would like to take these questions?
I can take the first one at the very least, if that's helpful. Okay. Thanks. And thank you for this question. And it's an important one because it's a multi-factor response. First, there's just challenges women entrepreneurs face in the world, just in generating sustainable income because of the structural barriers that they face with the lack of an enabling environment in society. There are major gender gaps in the economy. For example, there's a pay gap and a labor force participation gap that has barely budged in decades. And because of for example, especially women's disproportionate share of unpaid care work and domestic work that prevents them from being able to spend more of their time in starting a business and growing it. They also lack access to rights and ownership of capital, so they end up in lower barrier to entry businesses. So that's the part that's in the society and the enabling environment. There's also some problems that they face in procurement systems, because procurement systems, as we mentioned before, are not fair. They particularly are aimed to have cost efficiencies and drive costs down, which actually has an impact on, for example, women in the lower ends of the supply chain who end up getting exploited because of these low wages that are created. So it's important to also think about the ways that there's just bias and barriers baked into systems and the way that we do procurement, and thinking about procurement as a social as something that can be leveraged for social outcomes is really important, because it helps us challenge the view that it's only about cost efficiencies, because if we do that, then we're not leveraging the full value that we can get, and the value for money that we can get out of procurement. And then finally, there are challenges with access to networks and skills that women are able to upskill to be able to become qualified suppliers for the other reasons that I mentioned, also because of the structural barriers that they face. So one way to manage that is to have supplier engagement, of course, as we heard from our fellow panelists. But another way to think about it is to support women to be in positions that they are underrepresented, as well as supporting subcontractors that are gender responsive. And so you may not be able to reach a women-owned business as your prime contractor, but you can also look at your second-tier suppliers and how that can impact. So just to say that there are many reasons that women lack access. I just want to answer briefly another question that I answered also in the text, is that many people ask about, and we had mentioned about the legal ramifications, like how can we introduce this bias into procurement systems to be able but what I would like to put it to you is actually the procurement systems are biased. This is a way to help undo the bias. And it is also rooted in international law and domestic law in some cases, but international law and norms and standards says that temporary special measures such as affirmative actions, preferential procurement is definitely sanctioned, and it is not in conflict with the fairness and transparency of procurement in general, which already has affirmative clauses, for example, from sourcing from domestic companies or from certain countries. So I hope that helps, and I'll stop there.
Sandra, would you like to provide any additional remarks, or should we move on to the next question?
Consider that I think that's
okay. So I think maybe that you would like to respond to this next question. For the poll question on suppliers, do you recommend asking about ownership at initial engagement or only for pre-qualified suppliers? How do you ensure that the same does not affect supplier base or procurement processes? And then similarly, the next question is, how can we ensure we receive and keep correct and up-to-date data on business ownership when working with thousands of suppliers?
Yeah, so in terms of the first one, so from a supply diversity perspective, in terms of the looks at the ownership, how businesses are being owned, managed, and led. And so then that is the focus. However, I think it is also incredibly important, and I don't think that means that we should not talk about actually the gender balance. And I think that by asking about it, it just demonstrates that it's another important piece. So it doesn't mean that it's going to influence, but it just sends a message that actually it's also important that they that is being thought about overall. In terms of the data, I think the other question was focused on the processes, correct? In terms of how to manage the time constraints. Was that the one, Lena?
To manage also the ongoing data. So if it changes from a woman-owned to or woman-run, there's a lot of questions about like ongoing monitoring and evaluation of your suppliers.
Yeah, so that's yeah, it is an ongoing process, and there isn't a beautiful shortcut answer which just automates it. The certification route is one of the is there to help us, in short, to try and manage this, because then actually the responsibility is of the certificates, and to provide you with that checked, and they have provided the certification, and they will do the relevant checks and balances. We also, because of the self-declaration, we also do that. And that's also valid for 2 years as well. So there's an element of trying to help give a bit of a period, so that then we make sure that we're not having to do it necessarily always on an annual basis. And we do ask the suppliers to let us know should the status change within that period. So the intention is that it should be a conversation that is, if there is a change like that, that they can at least alert us to help us manage the process. But certification definitely does help, because at least then they can support in that data process, because otherwise it can be quite heavy.
Okay, and then last question, although there are about 40 remaining in the chat, how do we communicate our commitment to gender responsive procurement to our suppliers and our stakeholders?
I can give a little attempt there. That's an incredibly important question. As you know, the first women's empowerment principles is about demonstrating high-level corporate leadership for gender equality. So one thing I would say, several things. First, you would have to be able to communicate externally and show your commitment to gender equality through being a signatory of the WEPs and but another part of that is engaging with other stakeholders like UN Women and UN Global Compact to be part of this global movement. It's a collective action. It's a project for gender equality. And so being part of that through engaging with the community is incredibly important. But then there's also internal communication. This is internal communication about the policies and practices, the rights that suppliers have. So having this easy to access and available in different languages, and cognizant of the different types of challenges that different businesses face is a really important part. But I'll stop there because I'm sure Sandra has really great information.
And just very quickly from my side, I'd say actually the external communication is so important to help build the trust with the suppliers in terms of what you're doing and why you're asking. That transparency and that trust, and especially gender is obviously is one area, but if you then start to also look at other diverse groups, even more building that trust is incredibly important. So making sure that you're having that dialogue and advocating those plans is only gonna help. So be it on your website, on any events that you're taking place, on reports, annual reports, industry events, etc. We often will use it as a point to communicate transparently, but also help people understand the intention, because you're potentially going to be asking for information, data, etc., etc. And so that's why you're doing it, and where this is all coming from.
Thank you so much, Sandra and Anna and Simi and everybody participating on the call today. This has been a very active discussion. We had over 1,000 plus participants today. And, you know, we've had a number of questions that I wish we had more time to get through, but I would like to refer you to within the chat. My colleague Caitlin has shared a lot of resources from UN Women and from UN Global Compact, which will answer the majority of the other questions that were raised. So please keep engaged. As my fellow panelists had mentioned, this is, you know, you need the full ecosystem to support this cause. We're all working collaboratively. It's all about cooperative action if we're going to see change in our generation, hopefully. Just to summarize quickly, Simi mentioned that only 1% of procurement contracts are awarded to women-owned businesses. So we know that there is inherent bias in the process, and there are a number of ways to ensure that we have more representation and inclusion in our procurement processes. And you know, this is an iterative process. Again, it is a journey, and no company is too large or too small to embark on this journey. Every single one of us has procured some product or service in our businesses, and so we can all really contribute to meaningful change if we commit to gender responsive procurement. Before you leave, I know that we are already 3 minutes over, but it would be great if you can get back on the Mentimeter and just answer this last poll, because we would like to keep this conversation going. We would like to have this be the kickoff to a series on gender responsive procurement, and we would love to hear from you. What topic would you like to learn about next? So if you can re-log into Mentimeter, what topic resonates with you for the next gender responsive procurement session? Reforming due diligence practices and supplier codes of conduct to ensure gender responsive business practices. Would you like to hear about meaningfully engaging with your existing suppliers? Gender lens investing and unlocking capital for suppliers as well, or something else that you can add in the Zoom chat. Maybe policy. I think it was covered a little bit today. It was definitely covered a lot yesterday. So would be interested if companies would like to learn more about policy advocacy in this space as well. Okay. So we have a majority who would like to learn more about reforming due diligence practices and supplier codes of conduct. So maybe that will be the next discussion. Anyways, thank you so much to all the speakers on the panel today. Sandra, super interesting to learn about the practical business implementation of gender responsive procurement at Unilever. Simi, thank you so much for your contributions, and Anna as well. I for one have learned so much from this session, and looking forward to working with you all in the coming weeks.